Chapter 7. There are different tales about how Tule Mountain got its name. Legend has it that there was an old fellow named Tule Frank Henderson on the Winnemucca Ranch at the base of the mountain. This Tule Frank hauled hay that was full of tules, a kind of reed. He sold it in Virginia City in the early 60s. He would stop outside of the city, walk in, and inquire which was bringing the highest price, hay or wood. Both were scarce. Then he would drive in and sell his load for whatever brought the highest price, wood or hay. Thus the mountain which he lived near came to have his name. Tule Frank is long since gone, but Tule Mountain remains on. Tule Frank is long since gone, but Tule Mountain remains a monument to his memory. Speaking of monuments, there is one on top of Tule made by rocks. Some hunters started it by piling a few rocks together. Then they wrote their names and addresses and the date of writing and placed the paper in a tobacco can on the top of the pile of rocks. A few more hunters, finding it, did the same, adding a few more rocks, and soon it became kind of a tradition. Everyone passing that way, hunters, cowboys, government engineers and all, added a few stones and another name to the tobacco can. The monument grew, and the scroll of names outgrew the tobacco can, and a 5-pound baking powder can took its place. The can was always placed directly on the top of the monument, but everyone took care to shelter it among the rocks so the wind wouldn't blow it away. When last I saw the monument, it was 8 feet square at the base, rising in a conical shape to the height of 8 feet, and it was 4 feet across at the top. On our excursions to the top of the mountain, our children and their friends would have their pictures taken sitting on top of the monument. There was a photo of this included in the book, and you can see it now. After the advent of the automobile, sage hen hunters had access to the mountain, and both the monument and the names on the scroll grew fast. There is many a prominent name in the baking powder can on the top of Tule Mountain. That next spring, High returned from wintering in town to his homestead to run in some wild horses. It was great fun to watch him. He had built a round stockade corral by setting long juniper posts compact and close together, 2 feet in the ground and 7 feet above. Then, wiring them together close to the top, he had a good strong corral. He had built 2 wing fences running downhill, one to the east and one to the south, forming a V opening into the corral. The bottom of the opening was about a half-mile wide. Our cabin was at the lower end of this V. We would climb on the roof and watch High single-handedly bring a bunch of wild horses down off the mountain. He headed them down toward the east and then circled them out across the flat towards the opening in the fence. Our cabin was just in the right place to turn him into the mouth of the wing. We would dance up and down on the roof and holler and whoop. High said we helped him to turn the horses, but we did it through sheer excitement. Once he got the horses inside the wing, they were practically his. They had to run up and through the V into his corral. We loved to watch him, for there was nothing more beautiful than wild horses running free and unfettered, their manes and tails flying in the breeze. Once they'd had a rope on them, they never again run with such free, easy grace. We had little time to watch High, however, for the wood had to be brought in for the winter. The surrounding hills, 3 miles away, were covered in a heavy growth of juniper, which makes excellent firewood, green or dry. That would be another long, hard job, for it would depend principally on AJ's health and failing strength. We made picnics out of the wood trips. I put a big lunch together, and everyone went. We could drive the first mile with the wagon. Then we had to unhitch old Johnny and put a pack saddle on him. It had irons fastened to it that hung down on each side of the horse. These irons were shaped like cradles and made a good place for the 2 smallest children to ride. We hoisted little Leslie on one side and baby Albert on the other. The rest of us walked, carrying the axes, the lunch, and the bucket of milk for the children. AJ would chop with one axe and I with the other. I had lots of strength, but it was surprising how much more ease AJ could fell the tree. The secret, of course, being that he could strike twice in the same place and I couldn't. The trees I felled were haggled down, but I came in mighty handy for packing the wood. We would load the wagon on the pack. We would load the wood on the pack irons. Sorry, the text is very close together in this part. We would load the wood on the pack irons, each stick 4 feet long, for Daddy was very systematic in everything he did. The wood would pack better being of uniform length. When loaded, AJ would tie it down and I'd lead Johnny down to the wagon. After unloading the wood and getting it packed into the wagon, Johnny and I had again the 2-mile hike back up the hillock, making a 4-mile walk each trip. If we had a good day, I walked 16 miles besides unloading and loading the wood. The picnic lunches were enjoyed by all. The children played, gathered flowers, and chased ground squirrels. Daddy chopped wood, resting a lot between times. We spent the whole summer long getting our year's supply of wood. One summer, as AJ was in the hills chopping wood alone, I was at home washing. A friend drove out from town to see him on business. I told him Daddy was up in the hills and wouldn't be down till 5 p.m., but I could always holler for him, as sound always travels up. Maybe I could make him hear. I stepped outside, cupped my hands around my mouth, and called, "Woo-hoo!" several times. I always boasted of my penetrating voice. I became aware of it as a child. We used to call our stock, and I had a different call for each kind of animals. Our cow pasture was half-mile away, down a lane bordered on either side by cornfields, back in Iowa. It was one of my jobs to bring in the cows. I could start down the lane singing, "Coo, boss, coo, boss, coo, coo, coo," and the cows would always meet me at least halfway. For the horses, we had an old bell mare named Bird. I could call, "Cup, Bird, cup, Bird, cup, cup," and soon she would come all the way, with the other horses following her. Calling the pigs, however, was where I would shine. They ran in a 20-acre bluegrass pasture, but the pig pen was up by the barn, where we called them in and fed them twice a day. I would sit on one of the tall posts in the pig pen and call, "Phooey, phooey, phooey." The pigs would all come squealing home. None of the other children ever had the success in calling that I had. It was a pity that they didn't give prize for hog calling back in those days. Now my hog calling voice came in handy on the homestead. I hoo-hooed several times, and we sat down to wait, not knowing whether he had heard me or not. Pretty soon here he came galloping down the hill on old Johnny, thinking one of the children was hurt or dead. I met him at the gate, telling him who was here to see him. He stopped in his tracks, and looking rather stern and then disgusted. Then he said, "By George, old lady, your voice may have lost some of its sweetness, but it hadn't lost any of its strength." He was glad for my loud voice, though, for it was business of importance that the man wanted to see him about. Wood chopping was interrupted for the day, but I was glad to get him home early, for he needed the rest. We corded the wood in our backyard. AJ was very particular about cording it. Each rick had to be 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 feet long. Those long ricks looked like a mountain of wood, but we needed every stick of it, for the following winter was one of the worst I'd ever seen in Nevada. About once a month our grub would run out, and we would have to take 3 days off and make a trip to town for supplies. In June and July, food supply came from selling sage hens that Daddy would shoot for me. By August, the birds were feeding on sagebrush seeds, which made their meat bitter. Daddy balked. He would not shoot sagey birds for me to sell. He was honest all the way through. He'd just be damned if he'd sell anything that he wouldn't eat himself. Grub was getting low, and I was nagging a little, for I wasn't going to see the children going hungry. I told him he didn't need to sell them. I would take care of that part. All he needed to do was shoot him for me. He was adamant, however. No, sir, he wouldn't shoot one bird. Then an unusual thing happened. It started to rain, something we never have in the summer in Nevada. It was a slow, gentle rain, every drop going into the parched ground. It rained 8 days, while our supplies got scarcer. We were beginning to tighten our belts and wonder. Then one morning the clouds cleared away and the sun came out, red hot as usual. The steam rose from the ground like a dense fog. I began again. "Come on, Daddy, go get us some birds. The children are in need of food. I think we're justified in selling sagey birds. Keep our family from going hungry." Daddy said, "Well, old lady, I'll compromise. I'll go down and kill a few where they're feeding around the spring. Maybe they won't be sagey. You cook a few of them, and if they're sagey and not fit to eat, we'll have to starve. I'll be damned if I'll kill any of them to sell." He was very reluctant, and very reluctantly he took his gun and started out. In a few minutes he came rushing back, bareheaded, his hat under his arm, shouting, "Look! Look what I got!" His hat was filled with mushrooms, big, beautiful ones, the finest I'd ever seen. Mushroom spores lie dormant in the ground at all times, waiting for certain conditions to bring them up. That warm, gentle 8-day rain had made perfect conditions for them to germinate. The entire countryside had popped up with mushrooms. We filled wash buckets, egg cases, dish pans, every conceivable container. They were the size of saucers, fully an inch thick, with the underside all pink and velvety. We were choosy in picking them. The finest grew under the black sagebrush where the leaf mold was 6 inches deep. We brushed away the leaf mold to get to the giant ones. We loaded them in the wagon, and away I went to town to sell them. I had never sold mushrooms, but I never doubted my ability to sell them. My only anxiety was getting them to Reno in good condition. We had covered them over with our wagon canvas, and they were in perfect condition when I arrived. The only sale I can remember was to a merchant on Commercial Row, who bought an egg case full and gave me $10 for it. The only reason I remember that sale is that I'd never seen that man at any time in the last 40 years that he hadn't asked to buy mushrooms again. Of course, it was the only time I ever had any to sell. I bought a wagon load of supplies and hurried home. I called that bill of grub my manna from heaven. By late September, the mountain and the valley quail were ready for market. There were literally hundreds of both kinds. The sale of quail supplied us with food for both September and October. Then came November and the deer, which were in abundance all over the hills. With the sale of game, we were never hungry. Edson got his first deer that fall when he was 11 and felt he was quite grown up. After shooting it, though, he felt sorry for it. It had looked beautiful, bounding away in its fright, and then his gun had brought it down. When he cut the throat, and those pleading brown eyes looked up at him and made him suddenly and inexplicably sad. Taking out his brown paper lunch bag, he sat down by the carcass of his deer and wrote this poem. In lieu of the law and in the book of reason, in lines plainly written I read that murder is sport out of season, with the price of the blood on your head. Now where can we hide the dead plunder that fell from our mischievous gun, and leave the wild forest to wonder at the spot where the murder was done? He said afterwards that he had never killed a deer that he didn't feel sorry for. He didn't think much of the poem, and was surprised to know that Leslie still has it among her treasured keepsakes on the same old brown paper bag that he had wrote it on.